Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Chris Murray. My name has been used in vain yesterday by a number of people. So it's really a great pleasure for me to introduce our second keynote speaker for this morning, to follow Bill Gates, and that is the president of the World Bank Group, Jim Kim. Now, for those of you who don't know Jim, he's not only leading one of the most important development organizations globally, but he's had really quite an extraordinary global health career as well. He's an anthropologist, he's a physician, he's an infectious disease doctor. He was a key founder and leader of one of the more impactful non-governmental organizations. He led, created, and was the energy behind the 3x5 initiative at WHO that was so important for scaling up antiretrovirals. Went on to be president of Dartmouth University, and then 5 years ago became the first physician president of the World Bank. So I think those of us in health and global health were really thrilled to have somebody that came from our background to be looking broadly at development and, hopefully keeping an eye on the agenda around health. There's two other things to tell you about Jim before he comes out. One is truth in advertising. Jim and I were interns and residents and infectious disease fellows together. We shared a schedule rotation, so he was on when I was doing my research and vice versa. We did that with Paul Farmer. So we've had quite a long interconnected history together. And the other thing that I think you'll see in his comments, I'm guessing, is that Jim not only brings a really strong technical understanding of health and development, but he brings an incredibly strong moral compass to his work. And I think he views his role at the bank not just as a development agency, but as trying to make the case around what's the right thing to do. So without further ado, please welcome Jim Kim.
Wow. Well, thanks, Chris, and it's really, really great to be here. It's great to be back with the University of Washington crowd, and great to be here talking about, I think, one of the greatest accomplishments in the history of global health, the Global Burden of Disease Report. And Chris and I have been doing various things together. Chris is one of the greatest schemers and plotters that ever has walked the earth. And the thing is, we love to scheme and plot together, but Chris still has skills. I've lost all my skills other than being able to scheme and plot. So in this case, we're working together on something that I hope will have some meaning for all of you. Now, I'm here and working with Chris because I'm extremely worried about the state of the world right now. This is a slide. This is a picture that I see every day. Young people gathered together from a relatively poor country who are on their smartphones looking at how other people live. So one of the things we found, and we've actually studied this at the World Bank Group, aspirations are rising all over the world. I call it a convergence of aspirations. It's not just that a few people in a country with exposure to the rest of the world have high aspirations. Everyone's aspirations are going up. And what we know is that if aspirations are met with opportunity, you can have dynamic economic growth and dynamic improvement in human capital, like we saw in some of the East Asian countries, in particular in Korea. But if aspirations are thwarted, you have a situation where people's frustration can lead to countries that go down the path of fragility, conflict, violence, extremism, and then eventually, as we saw over the last couple of years, migration. Now, this is me. Many, many years ago, I was born in Korea. And in 1959, Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. My aspirations and my parents' aspirations were very high, but it's because my parents were two of probably a few hundred Koreans at that time who had exposure to the United States. My parents actually met and were married in New York City. And so exposure to New York City rose my parents' aspirations, and so then we moved to the United States. But in 1963, when I was 3 years old, here's what the World Bank said about Korea. It said that Korea would find it difficult without foreign aid to provide its people with more than the bare necessities of life. So the 2 points that I want you to take from this particular story is, one, the World Bank essentially had written off Korea. It pointed out that most of the natural resource wealth was north of the 38th parallel, and also literacy rates were very low, less than 20%. So it was an extremely poor country. This is why in many African countries, you'll hear them talking about being able to follow the Korean model. I met the great Prime Minister Meles right before he died, and he told me that they're specifically looking at how they can emulate what happened in Korea. Second thing I want you to know is that it wasn't until 1962 that Korea got its first World Bank loan. Before that, the determination was that Korea was not creditworthy. First loan was for transportation, second was for education. And when Korea elected to take the second loan for education, there was much criticism in the World Bank. The World Bank said, that is crazy. Why would you take a loan for education? Now, I have this great privilege of leading this institution, and every day when you walk in, you see this. Our dream is a world free of poverty. But I just, I am in this job for just completely freak reasons. I mean, I still to this day don't know how I got the job. But let me just tell you a quick story. One of the reasons maybe was my interview with President Obama. Now, I had been so taken with President Obama early in his career. And when I found out that his mother got her PhD in anthropology, I was one of probably like 5 people who requested her dissertation from the University of Michigan archives, and I read it. I read her dissertation. This is 2006, 2007. And so when I walked in the room, he said, it was very striking. He said, Jim, what do I tell people like Ernesto Zedillo? I don't know why he talked about Ernesto Zedillo. Ernesto Zedillo, former president of Mexico, great person, macroeconomist. He says, what do I tell a person like Ernesto Zedillo who might ask me, why would you choose a physician and an anthropologist? Why wouldn't you choose a macroeconomist? And so I said, well, President Obama, have you ever read your mother's thesis? And as I think everyone knows, he's a great reader. So he said, well, yes, I have. I said, well, you'll remember then that she showed that while the economists predicted that the Indonesian artisanal industry would collapse under the weight of globalization, she actually showed that the Indonesian artisanal, especially metalwork, she studied the metalwork artisans, that she showed that it actually exploded under globalization. He said, that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to tell you what growth rates are going to be from 30,000 feet, but I've been on the ground doing work in development for most of my adult life. I'm going to tell you how things are working on the ground. He looked at me and he said, okay, I get that. Later, we were in a social situation, and he was sitting, and he was saying, Jim, it's one of the best ploys to get a job I've ever seen. So I'm there, but you'll begin to see through this talk just how unlikely it was that I was a choice. Now, I went to graduate school, and Chris and I both did MDs and PhDs, and we met at the point of doing our training. But it was just idyllic, and my time as an anthropology graduate student was just some of the best years of my life. We read Marx and Engels and Bourdieu and Jean-Paul Sartre and all the latest theorists, in addition to the anthropologists and Max Weber and Emil Durkheim. And I also taught the beginning anthropology course. And it struck me how the evidence suggested that human solidarity was hardwired into our brains. And an anthropologist from University of California, Davis, Professor Hurdy, wrote, and I think she's more of a biological anthropologist. A long time ago, she writes, a long time ago, at some point in our evolutionary history, but before anatomically modern humans, and before such distinctively human traits as language, there emerged in Africa a line of apes that began to be interested in the mental and subjective lives, the thoughts and feelings of others, interested in understanding them. And in this respect, they were already emotionally modern. And she argues that the distinguishable feature that makes us human is that we have, and I quote, we're emphatic and curious about the emotions of others, shaped by our ancient heritage of communal care. Now, when I was in graduate school in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a dramatically competing worldviews. There was one group of countries that said the right approach is to have planned economies that trade with each other. And the other group of countries said, no, market systems are really the way to go, more dynamic, more economic growth. And we were, of course, captivated as young students, many of us in graduate school, by the logic and the sort of seeming scientific rigor of the Marxian program. But of course, it turns out that Marx missed a lot of things. And many of you I'm hoping some of you are specialists, and so I'm not going to go into my analysis of it, but there were competing ideologies at that time. Now, out of this graduate education, the question for me was, how do I embrace these grand notions of human solidarity, embrace these grand notions of social justice, and do something practical that isn't just sort of punching a clock every day, but addressing the problem of human solidarity as a medical doctor. And so I met these two people, Paul Farmer and Ophelia Dahl. As Chris mentioned, Paul and Chris and I were interns together, and we began talking about, if we are physicians, and Paul's also an anthropologist and a physician, if we're physicians and we're anthropologists, what's the nature of our responsibility to the world, and what project should we take on? So we created Partners in Health, founded on the fundamental notion that came from Latin American liberation theology of making a preferential option for the poor. It wasn't a religious organization at all, but it was the notion that the poor should come first, and that we should not compromise in trying to provide services, provide the things that the poor want and need, and not think about a different standard altogether just because they were poor. There are echoes of this at the World Health Organization. The Danish physician Halfdan Mahler, who was also a socialist, in 1978, there was the Alma Ata Declaration, and it read in part, health is a fundamental human right, and the attainment of the highest possible level of health is the most important worldwide social goal, whose realization requires the action of many other social and economic sectors in addition to the health sector. Development in the spirit of social justice, they said. It was a great slogan, it was a great campaign, but having participated in a Health for All project in Korea some years after this, there wasn't a plan, there wasn't an implementation strategy. It was everything and it was nothing. And that was why there was an argument between Jim Grant, of course, and Halfdan Mahler about narrowing the focus. That's where we get Go BFFF. You guys probably know that story well. But a wonderful idea, making sure that everything we do in global health is firmly rooted in a moral vision. Now, what did that mean? This is Haiti, and it was the first country that we worked in. It meant access to food, access to education, access to health care, decent work, as the ILO would say, or a good job, as we would say at the World Bank. Very similar things. But it meant something else, too. It meant that we would bear witness to the suffering of the poor and continue to ask the question of why they suffer as they do. Is it their own fault? Is it just the accident of birth? Are there structural reasons for their poverty? Are there structural reasons for their poverty that are rooted in the history and political economy of these particular countries? And so we both provided those things that they needed and wrote about what we thought were the structural sources of their suffering. Now, the first time I took over a project at Partners in Health was in Peru in a squatter settlement like this one. And we thought that this would be our first foray into urban health in poor communities. But what we found was an epidemic of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And it was literally an outbreak. There were 50 cases in a town of 100,000 people. And it tested us fundamentally, because we had made a lot of grand statements about a preferential option for the poor, about the fact that we were not going to compromise. And here was a problem that's among the most difficult to treat in all of medicine. At least 18 months of therapy, probably 12 to 16 months of an injectable, an intramuscular injection 6 days a week, with drugs that have hugely difficult side effects, including making people psychotic. Because the drugs that you have to use, since there have been no new TB drugs for a long time, were old and toxic. Now, we thought hard about this, and we thought, okay, look, we're the ones who said it, preferential option for the poor. We got to treat these patients. And we found patients like this. This is Melquiades. And there's a film that's recently been made about Partners in Health, and Melquiades is one of the stars. So Melquiades had been treated over and over and over again in a TB program that was really quite a good program. And because he had failed treatment 3 or 4 times, and we knew that he was getting directly observed treatment, the only possibility was that he had drug-resistant disease. But at the time, the entire global health community, and I hope that people here remember what that was like, the entire global health community was saying, you're idiotic, you're stupid. We read Chris's World Development Report. It said that drug-sensitive TB is cost-effective, but drug-resistant TB is not cost-effective. So don't do it. In fact, the head of the Peruvian National TB Program, who had created a fantastic program, said, if you treat a single patient, we'll kick you out of the country. Now, quite literally, and I think now, revisionist history is a wonderful thing. Many people remember themselves as being supportive of MDR-TB treatment. I can tell you they weren't, right? They weren't. They said it's not cost-effective, it distracts attentions from regular TB, it can't be done anyway, drugs are too expensive, there's not enough money in the world to pay for it, it's not that well transmitted anyway. They actually made the argument that because it's resistant, it's less fit. And Chris's sister, who's far more accomplished than Chris in many ways, Megan showed us that these resistant strains were just as fit and sometimes more fit than the non-resistant strains. And anyway, at the end of the day, it's the patient's fault, right? So we would go into the Russian prison system and say, look at all these patients who have drug-resistant disease. And we were told the most fantastical stories. One guy I remember told me, no, it's not drug-resistant TB. Well, then what is it? They're not getting better. And he said, no, they're doing these tricks. I said, this is a prison. It was a prison. It's by definition directly observed. They have to sit in front of the nurse, and they do an oral check after they give the drugs. So no, what they're doing is they're taking the pills, and they're putting it up to their mouth, and they're throwing it and catching it in their shoulder, right? And I said, can you show me how to do that, right? This is how crazy people were. They were so afraid of having to tackle the problem of MDR-TB because it was so complicated that they would make all these arguments. And with Megan and with lots of good work that we showed it was just as transmissible, the world changed. And this is Melquiades. I met him again 10 years later in Lima, Peru, where we were holding our annual meetings. But during that time, we kept arguing, come on, folks, it's not about assuming that what there is now is the only thing that would be available. It's about expanding the pot. And I have to say, what changed everything in MDR-TB treatment was we received a $44.5 million grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The only ones who took a chance on really tackling this issue. And, I'm so grateful to both Bill and Melinda. I mean, there's so many parts of my career that wouldn't have been possible without their support. But here's the thing. It wasn't that these people were saying, you guys are good guys. We really appreciate the fact that you're trying to do this, but we just don't think it's going to work. That's not what it was. It was anger. It was an intensity of anger that you had to really be there to experience, because they were kind of saying, you arrogant little, dilettantes. If it was doable, we would have done it. What are you accusing us of, right? And we weren't being directly accusative. Well, Paul Farmer sometimes was. He was very tough about this one. But because we were seeing this thing unfolding in front of us that we knew was going to be a tragedy, especially in countries in Africa where HIV and TB were going to come together. And as everyone knows, HIV knocks out that part of the immune system that keeps TB in check. And we thought we were going to see explosive epidemics of MDR, TB, and HIV. Well, around this time, AIDS was also happening. And of course, everyone remembers that because of the amazing work of activists, we had drugs by 1996. but there was no one being treated with HIV. And so we sort of looked at ourselves and said, hey, it's the same thing. It's happening all over again. It's the MDR-TB all over again because everyone was saying, no, you can't treat HIV. But there were 25 million people in developing countries living with HIV. And we kept saying, are you kidding me? You're talking about a passive genocide. We're going to let 25 million people die because we think, what? It's inconvenient? Now, people, young people especially, don't believe me when I tell them that people were saying, let them all die. So I just brought a little
If you've traveled
vignette.
in rural Africa, you know this. People do not know what watches and clocks are. They do not use Western means for telling the time. They use the sun. These drugs have to be administered during a certain sequence of time during the day. And when you say, take it at 10 o'clock, people will say, what do you mean by 10 o'clock?
That was Andrew Natsios, a very good person, a person who cared a lot about developing countries, and he was the administrator for USAID. But this was one of the reasons given for not treating HIV, for the US not putting a single penny into HIV treatment. And let me tell you, once again, revisionist history is wonderful, because everyone remembers themselves as being HIV treatment activists, but they weren't. The number of people who were fighting for treatment for HIV in the early 2000s was tiny. And I'm going to talk about why I think that happened, right? But this was the head of USAID saying that Africans can't take these medicines because they don't know time. He had actually visited Africa just prior to his testimony, and the people I knew in Africa said that the only one who was late for every meeting was Andrew Natsios. Now, I'm going to get back to this because I don't want, especially the young people here, to make the wrong conclusion from this. It's not because he's a bad person. It's because of the way people's minds work. Now, this was Joseph June, one of the patients that we found in Haiti, literally carried to our clinic. And at the time, the World Bank famously argued that, quote unquote, quote, treatments, antiretroviral therapy, are far too expensive and uncertain to warrant subsidies. That was the position of the World Bank at the time. Well, Joseph June never thought that he himself was not cost effective, and this is what happened. And we used this picture in a World Health Report in 2003, and it spread everywhere, to the point where I went to Toronto for the annual AIDS meeting, and I saw a Kenyan poster with Joseph June's before and after picture. And I didn't see it. It was our Haiti team. And the Haiti team came to the people from Kenya and said, hey, that's Joseph June. And they said, no, he's Kenyan. And they knew where he got treated. They knew what medicines he was taking. So we had actually brought Joseph June to the Toronto meeting, and we brought him to the poster, and they then believed us, and they took pictures, they were happy. But that's what happened. Joseph June became Haitian. He became Zambian, he became Namibian. He became the symbol of what was possible, and of course now, close to 20 million people treated. And I think, let me tell you, my great hero in all this is George Bush. George Bush agreeing to start the PEPFAR program was so, it was something that was so unexpected. And it changed, frankly, the economic growth profile. It changed everything in Africa to have the leader of the United States come out so strongly in favor. But again, the World Bank was exactly on the wrong side of the issue. It was continuing to argue that HIV treatment is not cost effective, and frankly, people here in Seattle were also not too excited about HIV treatment. But again, don't make the wrong conclusion. Don't think that it's because they're bad people. There are any number of ways of thinking about it. The most crude way of thinking about it is the Oklahoma syndrome. Young people don't know the musical Oklahoma. There's a song that says, everything's up to date in Kansas City. They've gone about as far as they can go. And you can't believe how much that infects the way we think about what's possible in global health. Carol Dweck was one of my favorite scholars from Stanford. She talks about the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset among students. The growth mindset students feel that they can learn anything, and a failure is something that they just go on and work harder. Fixed mindset students think that every result they get is the exact accounting of their own ability. When they do badly on a test, they're destroyed. And she showed that you can actually change fixed mindset people to growth mindset people. We need a lot more growth mindset in global health. But we did a World Development Report on behavioral economics. It was really interesting, and the conclusions that we came to are most people think that most people, especially at the bank, think that they think rationally based on evidence. But what we found that far more important is that people think automatically. They fill in missing information, think quickly, don't really do the analysis. They think socially. People are deeply influenced by the people around them. And I think this is what happened in people saying no to MDR-TB, no to HIV treatment. And also they think with mental models. They get models in their brain like things like they don't have watches. And it affects everything they do. And we even did a study inside the World Bank that showed that even World Bank employees very much adhere to these kinds of patterns. Now, at this point in my career, this was in the late 90s, I had become so upset with the bank being on the wrong side of issues so often that I was an editor, one of the editors of this book, Dying for Growth, in which it was really part of a broader movement called the 50 Years is Enough movement. And so I was part of a movement that was trying to close the World Bank and IMF on its 50th anniversary in 1994. Now, we lost that argument. I'm very glad we lost that argument. But this was a 500-page critique of the bank that had focused so much on GDP growth that it was not focused enough on things like health and education, which brings us to the topic for the day. The bank has systematically been focused on infrastructure. The bank has felt that the idea was that you helped countries to get rich, and then after they get rich, they can invest in health and education. And it was, in fact, in the early years, investments in health and education were literally called social capital overhead. The idea was that infrastructure investments would happen, and then human capital development would be a consequence of development, not a contributor to it. Some experts in the bank at the time referred to investments in social services as amenities, a missionary function, or even a soup kitchen. In 1949, a bank vice president named Robert Garner, who was actually the celebrated first head of our private sector group, IFC, visited Colombia, and the Colombians presented a balanced proposal that would balance investment in roads, energy, schools, and health. And he said to them, "Damn it, we can't go messing around with education and health. We're a bank." Now, one of the great things about being head of the World Bank Group is that I have never seen an organization that's so focused on evidence. Now, there's deep biases, of course, still. Everyone has their biases. But the bank changes as the evidence changes, and certainly in the last 20 years, it's changed a lot. Part of what we've done is to try to invest more in health and education, but at the bank, it's different because the countries have to agree that they want a loan, even a very low-interest loan, for health and education. This shows how much financing for health has grown. This is global health investments. It's exploded, and of course, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are a critical part of it. But going back to the first slide, the convergence, the explosion of aspirations, it's not nearly enough. This is not going to be enough to meet the aspirations of everyone in the world who wants full opportunity. So when I joined the bank in 2012, we quickly established two goals because I believe that setting goals and setting deadlines is critical. We did it with HIV, with the 3x5 initiative, which I'll talk about in a bit. But now we have two goals. End extreme poverty by 2030. And it's very clearly defined because we wouldn't it's not just a rhetorical campaign. It's less than 3% because 3% is what's going to be left as a result of what we call frictional poverty, disasters, et cetera, that we cannot get to zero very easily. And the second goal, first time the bank has ever dealt with the question of inequality, the second goal is to boost shared prosperity. In other words, see the incomes of the bottom 40% rise faster than overall economic growth. 3 ways to get there. And the first, as always, is inclusive and sustainable economic growth. And we're focusing extensively on getting private sector involvement. I'll talk more about that in a bit. The second is investing more in human capital, which is why I'm here today. And the third is by fostering resilience to global shocks and threats like climate change. When I joined, we were not especially well-liked by the climate community, but we've really shifted completely, and we're now the largest funders of climate change-related activities in the world, and will get bigger and bigger over time. You know, people ask me about this all the time in a political context, and I said, well, as far as I can tell, there's not a single election that has changed the evidence on climate change, and so we have to keep going. So far, so good. Now, this, I think, was one of the most important speeches of our time, and it gets right back to the original question: what is the path? Is it planned economies that trade with each other, or is it capitalism? And Xi Jinping at Davos, I think, gave one of the most important speeches of the last few decades. And here's what he said. He said, and partly in response to sort of events, whether you like it or not, the global economy is the big ocean you cannot escape from. Any attempt to cut off the flow of capital, technologies, products, industries, and people between economies and channel the waters in the ocean back to into isolated lakes and creeks is simply not possible. So the leader of the largest communist party in the world is telling us that the global market system is what we've got. And the key in what we're doing at the bank every single day is to try to make sure that everyone can swim, that the global market system works for everybody. Now, this is the Occupy Wall Street movement. And is there anyone here who participated in Occupy Wall Street? Typical conservative global health community, huh? Well, I can tell you that many of my friends, and certainly many of my friends' children, participated in Occupy Wall Street. And they had a critique that was pretty straightforward. We are the 99%, and the financial system doesn't work for us. Pretty good critique. But I've been inspired by Professor Robert Shiller from Yale University, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, who wrote a book, and he tells me that it's sold very poorly, but he wrote a book called Finance and the Good Society. And in it, he argues that, and I quote, finance, despite its flaws and excesses, is a force that can potentially help us create a better, more prosperous, and more equitable society. We have the potential to support the greater goals of good societies, prosperous and free societies in the industrialized as well as the developing world, if we expand, correct, and realign finance. And he literally, he writes in his book, he calls us out. He says there are groups like the World Bank Group who are charged with using every tool they can to make life better for the poorest. Now, you know, when I went to the World Bank Group, I knew a lot about development, but I didn't know much about macroeconomics or finance, and so I had to do intensive reading and studying. I had to ask tons of stupid questions in seminar rooms with our team, and I had the great privilege of learning about finance, and finance was just fascinating. I learned that the rich use these sophisticated financial tools, leverages, swaps, derivatives, insurance, to make themselves richer, and they do it every day, and they're brilliant at it. So our mission was to find a way to use those tools of the rich to make that they use to make themselves wealthier, and use it on behalf of the poor. The World Bank invented the swap. The swap is a pretty straightforward thing where you exchange cash flows to achieve positions based on your risk tolerance. And over time, we've developed derivative instruments that manage all kinds of risk, commodity risk, disaster risk, exchange rate risk, interest rate risk, and most recently, pandemic risk. I'll tell you about that in just a second. Another great idea is leverage, right? So when rich people take on a project, they almost always try to share as much of the risk as possible with the capital markets. We haven't done that effectively for poor people. They take a little bit of money and stretch it into a lot of money. We're only beginning to do that now, and the Global Finance Facility is one way to do it. Now, here's where I think the great hope lies in addressing this issue of rising aspirations and danger if we don't meet them. The size of the global economy is $78 trillion. There is $10 trillion sitting in negative interest rate bonds. In other words, you give a bank your money, and rather than receiving interest from them, you pay them to keep your money. The Japanese Central Bank, the European Central Bank, the German Central Bank, many banks are providing negative interest rates. Now, there's an ongoing question about how deep you can go into negative territory, but that's what exists today. 10 trillion. So people are losing money, but they're so worried about risk that they put their money there. Another 24 trillion in very low earning government bonds, 1% or less. And another 8 trillion literally sitting in cash. This is 1,000 € bills sitting in people's safes at home. So there's a huge opportunity, and the opportunity is for us to use all these tricks that the rich use every day, use these tricks to help this capital come in off the sideline and finance things mostly like infrastructure. The great opportunity is that if we're successful in doing that, then there'll be much more money left over for things like health and education. There's also potentially a role for the private sector in these areas, but we have to go forward very carefully. Now, the Global Financing Facility for women, every child, it does just that. Every dollar invested in the Global Financing Facility leverages 4 other sources of funding: domestic government resources, financing from the World Bank Group, aligned external financing, this is other development banks, and private sector funding. So every dollar, at least we think, leverages 4 more dollars. So if the Gateses, by the way, once again came through. They were donors and they just announced another $200 million gift. But using that calculus, a $200 million gift to the Global Financing Facility will translate into $1 billion for health. We have to do more of this. Ebola was awful. And you know, I kept pushing and saying we need to do something that's different about the next time. The 78 IDA countries, the 78 poorest countries in our portfolio, they need some kind of protection. And everyone just there was a little enthusiasm at first, but then it died because the situation for pandemics in the world is the same every single time. Panic, neglect, panic, neglect. And so when my economists say, Jim, why do you keep pushing on this on this sort of pandemic insurance? It's so hard. Why are we going to do it? And I finally said to them this. I said, do you guys remember what you felt like when Lehman Brothers fell during the financial crisis? And they said, of course. I remember where I was. I remember what I was thinking, what the implications were. It was awful. I said, well, I remember that, but I also remember how awful we felt during the Ebola outbreak. Right? And Peter Piot is here. I know Peter, I'm sure, was just going crazy, seeing that there was nothing happening and it was spreading so quickly. And so I said to them, I will never, just like you will never forget the fall of Lehman Brothers, I will never forget Ebola in these 3 countries, so we need to do something. So guess what we did? We created a pandemic insurance policy. This is an actual bond. It's $425 million that will immediately disperse once a pandemic reaches a certain level. And again, the Gates Foundation was critical because the modeling groups, along with infectious disease doctors, were able to come up with an annualized risk for their 3 viruses, polymyxoviruses, the coronaviruses, and filoviruses. For these 3 now, for the first time in history, the 78 poorest countries are insured. What that means is, for the Ebola outbreak, the little bar on the left, we have a cash window. And the cash window can be dispersed for anything. And it would have dispersed in December of 2013 when the first cases were there. We're doing this with the World Health Organization. But the first major tranches of $100 million would have happened at a point in which the epidemic was 10 times smaller than when money eventually flowed. The first donors to the Ebola outbreak was the World Bank. That's not what we do. But when I talked to my friends who were out there watching it, they said, this is the worst thing we've ever seen. You've got to do something. So within 24 hours, I had the board agree to $400 million, immediate disbursement. And we don't work that fast, but the money was available within 9 days. It usually takes 6 months to a year. And it taught me that we need to do this. And so this is cool stuff. We pay about $37 million for a $450 million policy, $37 million a year on average for a $450 million policy. Now, the people who invested know that they could lose all their money if something happens. But these are folks whose other option is a negative interest rate bond. So for an average of about 8.7% interest, they were willing to put their capital at risk. And now the middle-income countries are coming and saying, can we be part of it? They'd have to pay their premiums, of course, but we hope this becomes an industry, because then insurance companies will give us independent assessments of pandemic preparedness, because they have to decide what the premiums are going to be. This is the kind of innovation that's possible with finance, and this is partly what we want to say to the Occupy people. Now, I'm running over my time, but please stay with me because we want to get through this. Now, this is a map of childhood stunting, right? I think that just like HIV treatment, 17 years ago, the catastrophe of childhood stunting is a stain on all our consciences. 38% of children in India are stunted, 40% in Afghanistan, 45% in Pakistan, 47% in Guatemala. And you guys know what this means now. We have so much better data. This is from Charles Nelson of Harvard Medical School, who studied three-month-olds in Bangladesh. From 1 to 5, they have as much as 40% less brain mass, fewer neuronal connections. They are not going to be able to learn as well. They're not going to be able to earn as well. We have overwhelming data on this. But those percentages are just a disaster. What are we going to do? Another crisis, the crisis of education. We measure education only in years of education, but here's what we found. We just released our World Development Report on education. 250 million children in the world cannot read or write. Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, 3/4 of third graders, kids in school, could not understand simple sentences like the name of the dog is Puppy. It's kind of a weird sentence, but still, you get the point. In DR Congo, more than 4/5 of third graders could not read a single word. In India, third graders couldn't solve two-digit subtraction, such as 52 minus 14. By 5th grade, only half of students could do it. In Brazil, the skills of a 15-year-old have improved, but at the current rate of improvement, they won't reach average rich country scores in math for 75 years, and they won't reach average reading scores for 263 years, if we go at the current path. And so we have a crisis, and there's a crisis of education, and it's a moral crisis. Because if children are stunted and their education is poor, they are not going to be able to compete in the digital economy of the future. Now, this is just off the press. This is from our World Development Report. We're beginning to try to do something that we're calling quality-adjusted years of education. And what you see is the top part of the graph is the actual years of education, but the bottom part of the graph is what the effective years of education is given their skill level. We've got to get there. We've got to get to the point where we're actually measuring learning. And so the WDR, the World Development Report, just came out. We need to make learning, not being in school, the goal. We have to act on evidence, the second part. Brain science is advanced. We can accelerate teaching through many, many new tools. And we have to align actors. Education can't be sectoral. It has to include everybody. Now, let me just skip over this. All right, so look, we need something different. I think that we need a movement, and we're calling it the Human Capital Project. We're doing this with Chris and IHME. One of the things that has been a systematic bias in development and in economics is that we've not taken into account human capital when we assess the wealth of nations. And so in a report that will be coming out soon, for the first time, we're including human capital along with produced capital, which is things like machinery and buildings, natural capital, which is energy, forests, agricultural lands, other natural resources, net foreign assets, which we've always counted, and now we're adding human capital. And the things we found about human capital are pretty stunning. The numbers, which I'll get to in just a second, are pretty stunning. But Richard Horton asked the question before, what's the social activist part? And this is something I obsess over, right? Because the evidence is so overwhelming, but in so many countries in the world, the heads of state can wax poetic about health and education, but if you look at the percentage of their budget that they actually spend on it, if you look at the percentage of GDP that's spent on it, it's ridiculously low. We've got to find ways of creating pressure so that they can't do anything but invest more. And again, I'm not blaming the heads of state, ministers of finance. They're under so many different pressures, and investing in health and education has not been one of those things that force them to act. Now, here is an assessment of the relative importance of human capital. Human capital is in the blue. So the light blue is produced capital, and the top is natural capital. In the wealthy countries, the vast majority of existing wealth is in human capital. In the lowest countries, in the poor countries, it's much lower. But this is really the biggest, the most distressing thing. This is cross-country differences in per capita wealth. So in poor countries, per capita wealth is just tiny, and human capital, of course, is a small part of that. Now, what we're doing with IHME is I've asked Chris to do some thinking about whether we could link human capital to economic growth. Because again, if we can link human capital directly to economic growth, then it could have all kinds of impacts. If we could say, look, your human capital investment and quality is so low that your prospects for growth are pretty bad. We could include that in IMF or World Bank assessments of potential economic growth. But also, I think private sector people will begin to say, wait a minute, let me rethink my investment. If foreign direct investment were to go down, and that would probably lead to cost of capital going up, and that will definitely get the attention of heads of state and ministers of finance. So if you take average years of completed schooling, standardized test scores, which gets at the quality issue, and functional health, you get this graph, which is just stunning. So the bottom quartile is on the left of countries that have changed their human capital, and on the far right is the top quartile. So between the bottom quartile and the top quartile, there is a 1.25% difference in GDP growth per year, right? Now, the non-economists, 1.25% of GDP growth per year is a stunningly big number. And so these are just correlations. We're not suggesting causation. We're just playing with this data. But the suggestion is pretty powerful. We've not taken human capital into account well enough. And if you do the regressions, you'll find that it has a huge impact on growth. Now, how do we make this work politically? And I'm so glad Richard asked the question. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is famous for having said, and there's no record of this, but everyone thinks that he actually said this. He met with labor leaders and others who were pushing him. And he said, great, I like your idea. Now go out there and make me do it. Jean-Claude Juncker, President of the European Commission, a wonderful man, said this in 2007 around the economic crisis. He said, we all know what to do, but we don't know how to get reelected once we've done it. So how do we create this atmosphere? How do we create this atmosphere where they can't but invest more in health and education? Julius Richmond, former Surgeon General, one of my mentors, he used to say that health policy happens with three things. Knowledge base, the evidence, which of course is what we come to IHME for, political will, and a social strategy. But I'd add more to that. I'd say that what we need is to build our strategy on the foundation of human solidarity. We've got to get back to our roots. Lots of discourse is moving away from human solidarity. And in addition to a social strategy and political will, we have to have financial strategy. In the case of the pandemic emergency facility, we could not afford to wait for political will to kick in, for countries to decide to provide support for the poorest countries in the world. So we went around it. We created a financial instrument that will do it for us. Now, I just remind you of this picture, and then look at this. This is an assessment from some time ago about the number of jobs in developing countries that will be eliminated as a result of automation. Enormous numbers will be eliminated. We know that this is happening. And so if you have high childhood stunting, poor economic outcomes, what's going to happen? Those children are going to be able to tweet. They'll be on their smartphones, and so many countries are on the path toward fragility and conflict that it is the thing that keeps me up at night. So I'm not doing this just to make it tougher for heads of state and ministers of finance. I'm doing it to make it easier for them, and I'm also doing it to make the case to donors that they should be even more generous in supporting health and education, because this is the danger we're looking at right now. If you think the Middle East and North Africa refugee situation was bad, just wait a little bit if we don't respond to this in Africa and South Asia. My mother's a theologian and a philosopher, and she had me reading Martin Luther King books and speeches from an early age. And this is one of my favorite vignettes of all time. This is from letters from a Birmingham jail, and it gets right to the issue of urgency and our need to step up. He wrote about a letter he received from a white moderate, a person who said, "I'm on your side." And this white moderate said to Martin Luther King, "All Christians know that the colored people will receive equal rights eventually, but it's possible that you are in too great a religious hurry. It's taken Christianity almost 2,000 years to accomplish what it has. The teachings of Christ take time to come to earth." To which Martin Luther King responded, "Such an attitude stems from a tragic misconception of time and a strangely irrational notion that there's something in the flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time itself is neutral. It can be used destructively or constructively. More and more, I feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people." Now, I am so honored to be here to celebrate the GBD. You know, we hope that what we do through this Human Capital Project is just take the stuff we've been working on and take it to an entirely different level altogether. We need to make not investing in people hurt, and not just the poor. It has to hurt everybody. I think, in fact, you know, if foreign direct investment goes down and capital costs go up, even the wealthiest in a country will begin to feel it. And maybe they'll start saying, "Hey, you know what? We really need to pay our taxes." That would be great. Now, we're going to do this. It's going to be incredibly controversial, and I'll tell you exactly what will happen. The countries that come out on top of the ranking will love it. The countries that come out low in the ranking will critique the methodology. And that's why I'm so happy to work with Chris, because Chris can defend his methodology to anyone. And it turns out that the work all of you guys are doing, collecting this data and defending the methodology and showing us what needs to be done, is probably one of the most important moral missions that one can imagine. Thank you very much. Sorry, I went way over.
Well, I guess the intensity of the applause speaks for itself. Brilliant as always. I'm so glad you are recovering the notion of solidarity. In this country in particular, it has been dismissed as a leftist concept, which, by the way, is totally erroneous. You mentioned Durkheim. Durkheim was anything but a left-wing sociologist, and that's where the concept really gets introduced in a rigorous way. And if we remember the name of the trade union in Poland that toppled the communist regime, it was called Solidarity. And it's such an important concept, and Richard Horton yesterday, speaking about planetary health, spoke about solidarity. So that is a theme that I hope we'll take out of that, a rigorous understanding of what it means and how it becomes an actionable perspective on what the world needs at this time of retrenchment from others. Clearly, a lot to talk about. We're running a little bit late, so I'm just going to have one question, and I ask a few people to prepare. Please, just 1 minute questions with the actual questions would help. The Human Capital Project, I mean, it sounds like an incredibly exciting perspective. What exactly do you fear that would be the stumbling blocks to make it come to fruition?
Well, I think that everyone's going to be in favor of it until they don't like the result that comes out of it, right? And so we have another ranking, the Doing Business ranking, which is, everyone, again, it's the same thing. The people who come out ranking low critique the methodology, and the people who come out on top. But what we've been able to show is that with the right kind of intervention, you can actually change your position. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to help countries take more seriously what they're getting. And so we have a new program called, well, not a new program, we have a program we've been doing for a while called Program for Results, in which you get paid after you get the result, not ahead of time to implement. And so there's so many new ways of getting better outcomes for the money that you spend. What we hope to do is literally move it from supply-driven, which is if you give us the money, we'll do it, to demand-driven, meaning, oh my God, what can we do to improve our ranking? What can we do to get better? Because I have people on the streets who are angry that we're ranked below the neighboring country. I have the industrialists coming and saying, look, foreign direct investment and bond spreads are taking a hit. What can I do to make it better? And it's not that we're doing this in any kind of contrived way. We're simply revealing to the world the data that already exists and just bringing it together and revealing to the world things which our friend Amartya Sen's been saying for a long time. Amartya Sen's been saying forever that growth is much more dependent on the quality of human capital than we have ever known. But I think the reason that IHME is so important is that Chris has perfected a way of dealing with incomplete data sets from difficult to work in countries and still get such powerful results. And so if we can do that in education, and we can do that in health, and we can begin linking it, it will be a service that we're doing to simply reveal to leaders that this is the connection, and in fact, there's so much that we can do to help you get better.
Very good. Questions, please? I see a number of hands.
Thank you, and I'm sure there are a lot of people who've taken inspiration from that. My name's Jane Holton from Australia. I have a long connection with global health, and recently I've moved into banking, so there you go. You've talked very much about the ambition you have for this new approach, and we've seen others in this room take on board new approaches. The Dahlias were unusual, contested, and you're talking about something which in this particular space is currently unusual and contested. How is it that we're going to take it from the unusual and the contested to a point of acceptance? Now, I will acknowledge that when you sit in the World Bank, you have relatively more power than many other people have. But what is it you think that's going to be crucial to getting to the point where we have trip off our tongue a new label which actually will underpin inclusive growth, which if you think about it, the OECD has come out and endorsed, the World Economic Forum has come out and endorsed. What we need is inclusive growth, and your chart showed there is real potential here. So how do we do that?
So, we've done a study on inclusive growth, which societies grow more inclusively. And frankly, there's hardly anyone in the world who's done more for that than Julio Frenk, right? I mean, Seguro Popular and the cash transfer programs, these things have a huge impact on inclusive growth. And it turns out that investing in health and education, social protection, is one of the most important ways of growing inclusively. Now, the thing that we didn't understand before, though, was that investments in human capital aren't just good because they decrease inequality. They're good because they increase growth. And that's something we didn't appreciate nearly enough. And what I hope is that this will be a whole new field in economics. Now, I'm not the economist. Paul Romer is our chief economist, and he'll be on stage later and have much better explanations for it. But what I understand of it, I think it could be very powerful. So we're going to have to go through a process where we share the preliminary analysis with all the people who are experts in this field. And if we can come to a kind of consensus that, yeah, this is reasonable, and in fact, what Chris has shown and the IHME has shown is you can track it over time, right? Then you have a formula for something that I think could be very powerful. And again, part of it is that we just have to be ready to take the critique, right? Chris tried something like this with ranking health systems, right, in 2000, and I thought that was a brilliant effort, but the world wasn't ready for it, right? I think after 17 years, Chris, I think the world's ready for this.
Hi, Dave Rue.
Hey, Dave.
I'm a lifelong technology investor. And let me first commend you for a long overdue focus on human capital in the patrimony of nations. As you are undoubtedly aware, running a bank, intangible assets are often the most valuable thing on a company balance sheet. And so it won't be a revelation for people in the private sector to imagine that in the same way, countries might also have large bodies of intangible assets. And in fact, when you look at the most valuable companies in the world, Amazon here, Microsoft, Facebook, Alibaba, when you look across the world, it turns out that overwhelmingly the largest asset each of those companies has isn't captured on the balance sheet. It's the balance sheet where you count up all the things that you can see, turns out to be a small fraction of how those companies are valued. Are there lessons from the private sector that can be employed as you refine this first stab at the methodology?
So Dave, Dave, first of all, Dave and I are friends, and he's one of the great philanthropists around and great support of IHME. I was going to ask you the same question, Dave. I mean, look, I think that there are huge numbers I think that these countries have huge liabilities on their sort of overall balance sheet that are not coming to the fore, right? And so the reason, the carrots are things like the global financing facility, right? We're talking about 20-year payback at 0% interest, right? And these countries would do just about anything to get access to 20-year money at 0%. So that's the carrot. But the stick is that, if you don't do this, we're not talking about something that's going to have an impact on you in 15 years. It will have an impact in 15 years, especially when the children become adults and work, but it will have an impact on you today, right now. And that's been the missing piece, Dave. We haven't been able to make it as proximate enough in terms of the impact. So that's what we're trying to do. And because what we're saying is, just because you don't feel it doesn't mean it's not there, right? And in fact, it's there. It's this silent thing that is destroying your ability to compete in the short, medium, and long term, and you don't understand that that's the case. So it's like it's almost like not investing in human beings is like Kodak, right? That countries all over the world are going to face their Kodak moment, and it's true. It's also true of climate change, but it's very much true of human capital. So I'd love to sit down over a beer and pick your brain about this, because I'm sure there are. I just don't know other than that what they might be.
Well, we've run out of time, ladies and gentlemen, here on the 20th anniversary of the GBD, a few months after the 10th anniversary of IHME, you heard it, the Human Capital Project, and if someone can pull that off, is the same man who brought treatment against multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, treatment for millions against HIV/AIDS, who's always been fighting the skeptics of what you call the fixed mindset, and has inspired millions around the world, and today has the position to make this inspiration a reality. So we look forward to another one of those seemingly impossible feats for an amazing cause, the Human Capital Project.
But we can't do it without IHME. IHME has to be part of it. Thank you and congratulations.
Thank you, James.
That's great. That's fun. That was really fun. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.